Now, the Chinese government says US lawmakers who want to ban TikTok are just part of a xenophobic witch hunt. For his part, TikTok CEO Shou Chew defended his company's autonomy and security.
Now, that's what we've been doing for the last 2 years, building what amounts to a firewall that seals off protected US user data from unauthorized foreign access. The bottom line is this: American data stored on American soil by an American company, overseen by American personnel.
Now, here's someone who knows all about global online threats. Alex Stamos is the former chief security officer at Facebook. He now runs a team at Stanford researching all of this. Alex, welcome to the program. Were you at all reassured by the reassurances offered by Shou Chew? Talk of the firewall, American control over data and so on. And also, how much of this is about data and national security, and how much about the US-China political relationship?
So, I have to give Mr. Chew credit for showing up to a hearing that united Republicans and Democrats in yelling at him about a variety of things. He talked about what TikTok calls Project Texas, which is a multi-year project by TikTok to create a version of TikTok that runs in data centers hosted by the American tech giant Oracle, and to build a variety of controls that they say would protect American user data. One of the reasons this is really critical, and the fact that really hurt TikTok yesterday, is that they were caught having Chinese employees spy on American journalists. This was revealed several months ago after they denied it over and over again. And the fact that they had denied that folks in Beijing could get to this data, and it was proven not true, makes it very hard for people to trust them now. Yeah. But what they're proposing is not totally crazy. It's hard to build that kind of system to protect against the engineers who are writing the actual code is really quite difficult. And one of the problems is that TikTok has not documented any of the technical details, so folks like us on the outside can have an opinion. They've shown some of this stuff to CFIUS, the American committee that looks at this kind of stuff, but that is not a very technical group. And so, yes, nothing he said yesterday makes me feel like the really difficult challenge they've set out to try to protect American data from Beijing is something that they could live up to.
And so then when China, the political leadership of the country, gives their reassurances, saying things like, we're not doing any of these nefarious things, stop defaming us, and as we heard earlier, saying it's a xenophobic witch hunt. But when they say that, do you buy it for a minute?
Not at all. So whatever you think of TikTok, you cannot believe the People's Republic of China when they say that they respect user data in the United States. The Chinese intelligence services, and the two at the forefront here are the Ministry of State Security and the intelligence services inside the People's Liberation Army, are in a kind of constant cyber war against Western companies and the US government. Over and over again, they have broken into large American companies to get access to either intellectual property, which is part of their overall economic development plan to make China dominant in really important 21st century industries such as semiconductors, or mass amounts of user data from Americans. They broke into Equifax, the data broker, and took a bunch of data, the databases of Starwood and Marriott hotels, travel information from the Sabre system. They actually stole the clearance information for millions of Americans, including my information, from the Office of Personnel Management in the US government. So that is why people don't believe when the Chinese government says this, is that they have this history of gathering up all of this data. And in the case of TikTok, the risk to any individual, not that big, right? TikTok doesn't actually know a huge amount about people compared to other apps that they might use, especially where they have personal communications.
Yeah.
But in aggregate, to have access to information on 150 million Americans and over 1 billion people globally, that is a data trove. There's no way the People's Republic would be able to resist using it.
Yeah, data is obviously a massive issue, and I want to come back to that. But there are other actual fears about TikTok too, particularly the potential for propaganda spread, manipulation of opinion, and so on. What is the potential for China, with influence over an app like TikTok, to push, not just allow, but push disinformation, shape narratives, elevate some views, suppress others?
So you do have to look at TikTok in the context of what is going on in the information war between China and the West. Over the last 4 years or so, the People's Republic has massively invested in their overseas propaganda capability. driven first by the unrest in Hong Kong, where the Chinese government found themselves outmatched by teenagers and students who were very internet savvy. And then because of COVID-19 and because of the embarrassment of COVID coming from the Wuhan area of China, that is something that the Chinese have tried to control the global conversation around. And they do through both overt and covert means. The overt means are state media and the sponsorship of all of these different media outlets that sometimes are obviously part of the Chinese government, are sometimes much more subtle. And then covert of the creation of fake accounts and identities where they push this propaganda. Both of those kinds of things you can find on TikTok. Can you find it more on TikTok than on Facebook or Twitter or another platform? There's no good evidence of that, but certainly there is the possibility that that stuff will be treated differently from TikTok than the American companies, where American companies have gone much more aggressive, first about Russian propaganda and now about Chinese propaganda.
Yeah. It was interesting. Shou Chew was really trying to distance himself yesterday, but you know, going back to the hearings, let's play one exchange where Republican Debbie Lesko, as an example of that, raises the treatment of China's Muslim minority Uyghurs. Let's have a listen.
Do you agree that the Chinese government has persecuted the Uyghur population?
Congresswoman, if you use our app and you open it, you will find our users who give all sorts of content.
That's not my question. My question is, do you agree that the Chinese government has persecuted the Uyghur population?
Well, it's deeply concerning to hear about all accounts of human rights abuse.
It's a pretty easy question. Do you agree that the Chinese government has persecuted the Uyghur population?
Congresswoman, I'm here to describe TikTok and what we do as a platform.
3 questions, 3 deflections. They're pretty much avoiding it altogether. I mean, does that concern you when you look at what the platform might do with something as sensitive as Uyghurs?
Yeah, I do think that was a very telling exchange. And it does demonstrate that while TikTok is technically a Singaporean subsidiary of ByteDance, ByteDance is technically not a Chinese company. I believe it's incorporated in the Bahamas or some kind of tax haven, but it is controlled by Beijing. The key executives who run the whole thing are in Beijing. Mr. Chew himself is Singaporean, but he must travel to Beijing all the time to go talk to his bosses. And what must be in the back of his head when he's being asked that question is that over the last several years, the Chinese Communist Party has massively brought to heel the domestic tech industry in China. Some of the most powerful, richest, most visible CEOs in China have been just disappeared and not seen by their families for months because they had tiny little criticisms of the Chinese Communist Party. Jack Ma is a great example of this. As we speak right now, one of the most important investors in the Chinese tech industry is currently nowhere to be found. Nobody knows where he is. And so if you're Mr. Chew, you have to dodge that question because the next time you go to Beijing, you do not want to be disappeared in the same way. And I think that it's not his fault. And it's not the fault of the people that work at TikTok. And it's not the fault of the employees of ByteDance who work in Beijing. I don't think they want to be spies for China. I don't think they want to manipulate the algorithm. I think they want to build a product that people like, and they've done a really good job of that. They built a really fun product that people like. But they live in an authoritarian system where they don't get to choose to only do that without also serving the desires of the party. And that has been demonstrated over and over again in the last several years.
Yeah, eloquently put. I wanted to go back and broaden this out again too, because I know you've written that these concerns, the sort of things we heard in Congress, they're bigger than one company, and that perhaps the Biden administration, for the moment at least, is missing an opportunity to sort of, address the big picture. That I think, as you wrote, TikTok is only one chess piece in a global struggle when it comes to control of information.
Yeah, it is a little silly that we have spent 3 years fighting about one company, and there is all this bipartisan agreement to try to ban TikTok, and it looks like that might happen. And the day after that happens, they can slap each other on the back and say, oh, we work together to keep America safe. But the truth is nothing will be fixed. If you scroll through the top apps on your phone, you'll find a bunch of them are from Chinese companies. Or maybe they're from American companies or European companies, but those companies have bad data practices. Or they're using ad networks where they take a huge amount of data and they sell it on the open market to anybody who wants to buy it, whether those are other advertisers or whether they're intelligence services. And so that is the core problem here, is that unlike almost every other developed industrialized country in the world, the United States does not have a federal privacy law. It is not actually illegal to take most user data and store it in China. Crazy enough, all these things they're yelling at TikTok about, Congress has never said in the law that you're not allowed to do that. And so the way to address this is not just to punish TikTok, which, like I said, does pose a risk. It is to look at TikTok as an exemplar and then use that as a lesson of what kind of privacy law do we want to build that says, one, how do we want companies to collect and use data? And that will apply to all companies equally, including American companies. And then two, where can data flow around the world? And my suggestion would be that the US and its democratic allies in Europe, the UK, Canada, Australia, Japan, and the like, come up with agreements around how they're going to treat each other's user data, and then have neutral countries have slightly different rules. India would be a great example of that, Brazil. And then have a group of countries that are known adversaries that have been bad actors for cybercrime in the past, China and Russia at the top of that list, and explicitly say that you cannot have American user data flow to those countries. That kind of solution would actually apply to the hundreds and hundreds of other apps we should be talking about, because if we spend 3 years per app, we'll never have this problem solved.
That's a good point. When it comes to China, ByteDance, and TikTok, China considers technology like algorithms to be critical to its national security. Do you think Beijing will accept any deal that removes direct control over TikTok's algorithm? I think you described the algorithm as almost creepily smart. Do you think TikTok would prefer to be banned or hand over that access?
So I think TikTok, the company, and ByteDance are trying to walk the tightrope between the U.S. and the People's Republic here. The whole idea of Project Texas was that they would be able to have American user data exist here, while a lot of the core intellectual property, while it would flow into the United States, would do so in a way that they still felt like they had control of it. And that is the crux of the challenge here, is how can you have secret software written by Chinese engineers that then touches American user data and say that you're keeping that user data safe? And so it's an interesting proposal. Again, there's no technical details, so I can't really comment as to whether it would work or not. I don't think it's going to work politically. In the U.S., there is no political will to defend TikTok or China. Both, we're once again back into presidential election season, and both parties are going to try to out-hawk each other on China. And you saw that in Congress, that it was almost a ratcheting up of who could say the crazier things about TikTok. And in the Chinese side, they don't really care about the economic outcome here. I think if ByteDance took all of their international TikTok business and spun it out into its own international publicly traded company, they'd make a fortune. That would be an incredibly valuable company, partially because that company could re-enter the Indian market where they're currently banned. Yeah. But they can't do that because the People's Republic, it is totally a huge embarrassment for Xi to allow that kind of thing to happen, and they would never allow the precedent to be set that pressure from America could cause a spin out. So I think we are headed to a collision course here, where if the U.S. gives the Biden administration the opportunity to shut this down, and that's what the current proposal is not just to kill TikTok, but to give the president the choice, and the president decides to ban TikTok, one, there's going to be a big legal fight in the U.S. The constitutionality of this kind of thing has never been tested before. And then there will be a showdown between Beijing and Washington, with ByteDance and TikTok in the middle. Right.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you this real quick too. I got two children who are young adults who are super smart people, I'd like to think. When I talk to them about data, they're like, too late. It's gone. Do you think when it comes to data, do you think it's just a reality that people under 40 don't care about that anymore as long as there's a payoff? Do you think they're looking at Congress and going, okay, boomer?
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly you didn't see a lot of young people with really vigorous young questions being asked yesterday. I have two teenagers and a preteen. And yes, there is a certain amount of nihilism among young people when it comes to data privacy. The flip side is they also seem to care a lot more about their impact on the world. And I think if you explain to them this is what they're participating in, and try to explain to them how they might be getting manipulated, right, young people are actually much more resistant. There's actually some actual quantitative data to show that young people are better at spotting online disinformation than boomers or people our age. Yeah. And I think there is some hope there, just because Gen Z doesn't care doesn't mean that it's not our responsibility as the older folks to pass a law here.
Yes, exactly. It's exactly what I said. Now, you listen to me, I said to them. Alex Stamos, really appreciate your expertise on this fascinating discussion. Appreciate it.
People on social media love to post about the news, but there's really no substitute for going to the story and talking to the people living it. I'm David Rind, host of the podcast CNN One Thing. Each Sunday, I pull aside a CNN reporter who has been doing just that, and we tackle one story that's been making headlines. Think of it as a deep dive, but digestible, so you can get on with your week armed with the facts. To listen, tell your device, play the podcast CNN One Thing.
Be My Guest with Ina Garten is back for a third season. On this season of Be My Guest, Ina talks to Stanley Tucci, Nora Jones, Misty Copeland, and Laura Linney. Here's Ina to tell you more about the show.
Hi, I'm Ina Garten, the Barefoot Contessa. When friends come to visit, of course I want them to have something delicious to eat. But what's also important to me is the conversation. It's the glue that binds us together, how we take care of one another. I've invited some really interesting people to visit me, to come to my barn in East Hampton. We'll share stories that will hopefully amuse and inspire you. And you're invited too. Hope you'll join us wherever you get your podcasts.
All right, okay, so here's an irony. In China, TikTok is banned, but its sister app is a huge hit, despite being heavily censored. Correspondent Selena Wang with The View from Beijing.
China is slamming the U.S. for considering a ban on TikTok, and China's Commerce Ministry has said it firmly opposes a forced sale of TikTok. Now, the U.S. may ultimately mandate a sale of TikTok, but experts say that's not in the cards because Beijing has ultimate approval over a sale. So Beijing may actually prefer TikTok to get banned than to fall into U.S. hands. But it is worth mentioning that China does not even allow TikTok at home.
Pressure is building again in Washington to ban TikTok, all because it's owned by a Chinese company, ByteDance. In China, TikTok is banned. In fact, it never existed. Instead, there's a separate version of ByteDance's app in China called Douyin. Boasting more than 600 million daily active users, Douyin was already a viral sensation in China before TikTok launched overseas.
So I've got TikTok pulled up on my US phone and Douyin on this China phone. They've got very similar homepages and interfaces. The only reason why I can access TikTok here in Beijing is because this phone has got an overseas SIM card in it and a VPN to get around China's internet firewall.
But Douyin has some more sophisticated features, especially in live streaming and e-commerce. And Douyin users under 14 can only use the app for 40 minutes a day and see kid-safe content.
Plus, Douyin automatically puts on this heavy beauty filter when I open up this camera function. Media is heavily censored in China. So if I type in a topic sensitive to the Chinese government on Douyin, say like Tiananmen 1989, nothing pops up and I get a text that says no search results available. Versus on TikTok, you'll see that a bunch of videos pop up about the massacre.
One of Washington's concerns is that because of its Chinese ownership, Beijing could use its propaganda and censorship methods on TikTok too. The other fear is that TikTok could be forced to hand over data to the Chinese government. But security experts say the national security risks are hypothetical at best. Beijing says the U.S. government has been abusing state power to suppress other countries' companies. But the irony is that China has outright blocked countless foreign websites and apps, including Google, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp, Netflix, and more. On Douyin, Chinese state media has been sharing TikTok videos from angry Americans.
But the big question from all of this is whether TikTok is just the start. As mutual distrust between the U.S. and China worsens, how are lawmakers going to deal with other major Chinese-owned apps in the U.S.? If you go into the Apple App Store right now under the section Most Downloaded Free Apps, 4 out of the top 10 are owned by Chinese companies, including shopping app Temu, fashion app Shein, and video editing app CapCut, which is also owned by ByteDance. So where's the U.S. going to draw the line? And how much could geopolitics impact the internet landscape in America in the future?
Selena Wang reporting there for us from Beijing, which is where my next guest, Mike Chinoy, served for many years as CNN's bureau chief and senior Asia correspondent. Mike spent more than 30 years helping Western audiences understand China. In his new book, Assignment China, he focuses on the often tense history of US journalists reporting from the mainland. I asked Mike about the TikTok tension and about China's growing global influence. Mike Chinoy, welcome to the program. Now, before we get to the book and the incredible stories in it, we have been talking about TikTok, its data collection, potential security threat and so on. I'm curious, in your own experience, how interested would China be in the data that TikTok collects, and how likely would it be to use that data and the influence of its algorithms to further its own interests?
The way the Chinese system works, it vacuums up huge amounts of data on its own citizens and whatever else it collect. But that doesn't mean that the Chinese are going through every little teenage girl's dance performance. But it does mean that if the Ministry of State Security or other security officials in China say to TikTok's parent company, we want information on such and such, the parent company, ByteDance, doesn't really have a choice. So the potential is there, but the notion that somehow everybody's data is being vacuumed up and made use of by the Chinese is unrealistic. But they do have the capability to focus in if they feel they have a political need to.
Yeah, a good summary there. Now, I want to stay with current news for a moment. There was that meeting between the Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russia's Vladimir Putin. First of all, let's have a listen to what National Security Council spokesman John Kirby told Christiane about how the US sees that relationship. Let's listen.
I think it's important to remember that this is a marriage of convenience, not of affection, not of love, not of deep, abiding shared interests. Where they intersect is pushing back on the United States and our influence around the world. They'd like to change the rules of the game. And in each other, they see a useful foil, they see a useful friend. But that's what they're doing. They're basically trying to use each other here to challenge U.S. leadership and the West, particularly in Europe, but elsewhere around the world.
Mike, would you agree with that assessment? I mean, what do you make of the relationship between Xi and Putin? And in particular, the tightrope Mr. Xi walks perhaps in wanting to leverage that relationship in a geographical power context, while at the same time needing Europe and the US in an economic sense.
I think that's a very good description, that Xi Jinping is walking a tightrope. On the one hand, I think the assessment that both Beijing and Moscow see each other as useful in countering the United States is absolutely accurate. There's no sentiment in this relationship. Don't forget, in the late 1960s, the Soviet Union and China almost went to war. But Vladimir Putin really needs China. It's his only big, meaningful supporter. And for Xi Jinping, it is a tool to push back against the United States. But it's tricky because China is facing serious economic problems, exacerbated by the way they managed the COVID, first the lockdowns and then abandoning zero COVID in a very chaotic way that caused a lot of fatalities. He needs to repair relations with Europe. The economic relationship with the U.S. is still extremely important, even though the two governments are at loggerheads. The two economies are very interconnected. So he has to be careful how far he can go. And I think that does constrain him somewhat. If it looks like the war in Ukraine is going to reach a point where the Russians are going to lose or Putin's going to be overthrown, it might modify the Chinese calculus. But at the moment, they want to prop up Putin while not being so much in the embrace of Russia that it really deeply damages very important economic ties with the West. Whether that's a balancing act he can carry off is another question.
Yeah. Okay, I want to move on to your book now because it's really terrific. It's called Assignment China, an Oral History of American Journalists in the People's Republic. What made you want to write it?
I began this project about 15 years ago, and the idea behind it is that the way in which the journalists who covered China do so is really important in shaping how Americans and people around the world understand China. But very few people know how journalists do their job, what it means to go out in the field and report. And so I thought it would be interesting to, in effect, tell the story of the people who have told the China story over the decades. What was it like to be the Life magazine correspondent in Shanghai in 1949 when the Red Army rolled in? What was it like trying to watch China in the 50s and 60s when you couldn't go there? What was it like going on the press plane with Richard Nixon in 1972, or opening the first U.S. news bureaus, or being in Tiananmen Square in 1989 as I was for CNN, or charting the rise of China? Because I think if people who consume news understand the way in which the journalists on the ground gather it, they'll have a much more sophisticated appreciation of the information they're getting, and also a better sense of the people who are out doing that job on the front line. So that's the background behind the idea of Assignment China.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, as you point out, Chairman Mao Zedong proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic in Tiananmen Square. That was back in 1949, and not a single American correspondent was there to cover the event. I know you first went in '73, later became CNN's bureau chief there. So what has been the theme of what reporters have gone through just to report news out of China? What are the common threads of their difficulties?
Well, I think the central theme, which comes through in my book, Assignment China, has been this constant battle of American and other foreign journalists to try and penetrate the veil of secrecy, to get beyond the restrictions that the Chinese Communist Party has put up in its effort to control the narrative. And there have been periods like the 50s and 60s and much of the 70s where American journalists weren't allowed to be based in China or even to go there. Then it opened up, and it's kind of ebbed and flowed depending on the domestic political climate in China and the state of U.S.-China relations. When I was in Beijing for CNN, 1987 to 1995, there was, of course, the crackdown in Tiananmen Square. But apart from that, the general trend was getting easier, and it got easier, but now it's gone back into reverse, and it's extremely tough as a beat now for foreign correspondents.
And leads us nicely into the next question. I mean, you write about a golden age of reporting on the ground, if golden age is actually the right term, which Tiananmen Square brought to a halt. Let's have a look at your reporting at that time, which was remarkable.
The assault on Tiananmen Square is now underway. There has been gunfire, there are people dead, there are people wounded in various places around Beijing. Remain on both sides of Tiananmen Square, but there is a brief lull after almost an hour of absolutely wild activity, including nearly 45 minutes of virtually nonstop gunfire from the troops. From my vantage point, where I can see the square and the avenues leading into it, I can see flames from an armored personnel carrier overturned and set alight by the protesters.
It was remarkable reporting of a remarkable event. As we said, you became CNN's first Beijing bureau chief. That was '87. What was it like reporting from China after Tiananmen? And how did you negotiate the barriers yourself with your own reporting?
In the year or two after Tiananmen, it was very tough. You couldn't get permission to really go anywhere or do very much. But what happened was, in the early 1990s, Deng Xiaoping, who was then the leader of China, moved to restart the economic reforms that he'd begun in the 1980s while not doing anything in terms of political reform. And as the Chinese economy grew, as the boom took shape, it became considerably easier. There were still all sorts of problems and suspicions, but increasingly, places in China, officials in China wanted coverage. They thought it would bring foreign investment. They thought it would help. So at the time I left the Beijing Bureau in 1995, it was the beginning of what some journalists that I interviewed for Assignment China described as the golden age, where as the focus was really on developing the economy, there was greater access and greater receptivity. And that really climaxed with the 2008 Beijing Olympics, which was kind of the high point in terms of press access. And after that, as the domestic political climate in China has changed, and particularly since Xi Jinping became the top leader, it's gotten much more repressive internally, and the Chinese government has felt emboldened to be much more assertive externally, and that is included in its treatment of the foreign press. And so we're seeing today a situation where just a handful of American journalists are very constrained in what they can do in China.
Yeah, and you write that the climate for China-based reporters is more restrictive now than at any time since it embarked on that program of reforms in the late 70s. Do you feel the doors have closed and are looking to remain closed for the foreseeable in terms of that freedom to report?
The doors are not completely shut. Most major American news organizations are still able to keep one or a couple of correspondents on the ground in Beijing. And frankly, I think the Chinese government, even as it seeks to reshape the international order, craves the legitimacy that comes from being able to say, well, we have a New York Times correspondent in our capital. We have Wall Street Journal correspondents covering our economy. So it's not completely shut down, but the numbers are dramatically down and the conditions on the ground are much tougher. It's much harder to travel around. There are all sorts of obstacles to interacting with people and interviewing people, and also a steady diet in the official government-run Chinese press that describes foreign journalists, American journalists as spies, has bred a kind of climate of distrust so that correspondents will often encounter people who are not only necessarily afraid to talk to them, but openly hostile. And there have been a lot of ugly incidents. So the result is that while there are still some folks on the ground in China, increasingly coverage of China has, in an odd way, come full circle from the beginnings of the story that I recounted in my book, Assignment China, where more and more coverage is being done from outside the country, from Taiwan, from South Korea, from Washington. People are kind of dusting off the skills of the old China watchers, which is what I was when I first began my career in Hong Kong in the mid-'70s. Scouring the official Chinese press for clues, trying to determine who's up and who's down. So it's a different kind of journalism that harkens back to the way in which the country was covered decades ago that journalists now are being forced to do because of the restrictions that exist in terms of access to China and being on the ground and being able to see it for yourself, which is, of course, the central thing you want to do as a correspondent.
Yeah. While the West often plays the short game, China plays the very, very long game. What do you think the West misunderstands about China, its goals, what it wants?
That's a really good question. I think we're certainly seeing a dramatic tightening in China. But I think this perception of China as the existential threat is overblown. I think what Xi Jinping wants to do is make the world safe for the Chinese Communist Party. And that means increasingly tight controls at home. It means throwing China's weight around wherever they can towards that goal. And increasingly, they've had the economic clout to use that leverage, for example, when they were angry at Australia because the Australian government suggested an independent inquiry into the origins of COVID. They imposed all sorts of very tough economic measures. They've done the same with Lithuania because Lithuania is close to Taiwan. So it's important, I think, in the discussion about China to be absolutely clear-headed about the need to push back in certain areas, but to not sort of overhype the threat and to not make the public discussion about China be one where, in the States, politicians are falling over themselves to show who can be tougher on China, and there's this ugly undercurrent of racism, suspicion of people of Chinese origin, and so on. So I think the need now is for even more careful and precise reporting and discussion about China and avoiding the kind of one-dimensional caricature that often animates both the press discussion and the more broad public discussion these days.
It's a fascinating book, and that was a fascinating discussion about it. It's always a treat to see you, Mike. Thank you, Mike Chenoy.
Thanks very much.
This week on The Assignment with me, Audie Cornish.
What we're finding is there's a shrinking of the middle class. It's tougher to get into the middle class, and it's harder to stay in the middle class.
Dr. Gary Hoover, economics professor and executive director of the Murphy Institute at Tulane University. Listen to The Assignment with me, Audie Cornish, on Spotify.
Now, banking stocks have been getting hammered again this week from anxiety we haven't seen since the 2008 global financial crisis. Confidence crumbling since two regional U.S. banks collapsed, putting greater scrutiny on the financial system and last-minute emergency measures being taken to stop Credit Suisse from failing. The US Federal Reserve called the impact of the crisis, quote, uncertain as it nudged interest rates higher on Wednesday. Walter Isaacson asked financial journalist William Cohen if he thinks the Fed is doing enough to stem the losses.
Thank you, Michael. And William Cohen, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So the Fed just raised another quarter of a point. You know, they've got to worry about fighting inflation, which is why they'd raise interest rates. But now they have this banking crisis. Do you think they got the Goldilocks soup right? It's just the right temperature?
I think on this latest round of Fed interest rate increases, they got it just right, Walter, because if they had not raised rates, then it would have signaled to the market that the financial crisis, this banking crisis, is worse than it probably is at the moment. If they had just kept rates flat, they would have been giving in to those who are concerned that perhaps this thing is spiraling out of control. And if they had raised it 50 basis points, they would have, in effect, ignored this quote-unquote banking crisis. So 25 basis points is perfect. Goldilocks is right.
And you say it's because this banking crisis is not spiraling out of control, in your opinion, and Chairman Powell's opinion. Why not?
Well, because I think in each case, in each bank that has failed in the last few weeks, has a sui generis aspect to it. Silicon Valley Bank was a very unique ecosystem catering to venture capitalists and their portfolio companies, providing those venture capitalists with all sorts of special deals on various pieces of financing. And then, many of those depositors at Silicon Valley Bank had more than $250,000. So they were, in effect, a vastly uninsured group of depositors. And so they started blithering with each other, Walter, told each other to, take money out. And no bank can survive a bank run like that. Signature Bank in New York was also different. I'm not sure we know exactly why that bank was declared to have failed and to be shut down. Something to do with crypto-related loan portfolios, something to do with their management team that's not exactly clear. I find it fascinating that Barney Frank, the author of the Dodd-Frank law, was on the board of Signature Bank. So that's still a little bit of a mystery, but again, not really connected to the main financial system. And then, of course, Credit Suisse failing last week. It's a sad end to a great institution, but that bank has been failing for years. So this was probably inevitable.
Well, let's get back to Silicon Valley Bank, because you call it the failure. You refer to the jerk theory, although I think you in the banking industry have a more technical term for it, which begins with A. Explain to me what that theory is.
Well, I think that the A theory, shall we call it, is frankly, again, getting back to who the clients of this bank were. Okay. This bank was at the center of the Silicon Valley ecosystem, hence the name Silicon Valley Bank. It had about 25 branches, most of which were in California, a few on the East Coast because they had bought a private bank there. But this was a bank that catered to extremely wealthy venture capitalists and their portfolio companies. And I think that this was also a bank that was used to catering to these individuals by giving them sweetheart deals and their portfolio companies, Walter, that were pre-revenue, pre-profitability, and yet still managed to get very favorable loans. And that just became a portfolio that isn't all that attractive.
You mean it was sort of a fear of missing out crowd out there that made people want to cater to them?